Committee will reconvene. Rabbi, we believe in free speech so much. We were waiting for you to speak to the press. That's our commitment to the First Amendment. So we're going to start with the gentleman from Georgia, Congressman Heiss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Holcomb, your organization, outstanding group, actually put forth the Pulpit Initiative and Pulpit Freedom Sunday. As you know, I was one of the original pastors that was a part of that group in 2008. Can you briefly explain to this committee what that event is and what's its purpose?
Absolutely. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you. The Pulpit Initiative was designed to bring this issue to a head and to provide a legal challenge to the Johnson Amendment because, as you know, and I'm sure you're well aware, federal law prohibits us from affirmatively suing the IRS outright to deal with this issue. So we started what's called Pulpit Freedom Sunday, where we encourage pastors across the nation to exercise their constitutional rights to free speech and the free exercise of religion, and many of them endorse or oppose candidates on that day, and a number of them provide courtesy copies of their sermons to the IRS and send them in so that they're fully aware of what's going on. We had encouraged, as I mentioned, a legal challenge, wanting to go head-to-head with the IRS on this issue and allow a court to rule on the Johnson Amendment's constitutionality or lack thereof, in our opinion. But the IRS has been unwilling to take the bait. It did harass and intimidate one of our pastors for approximately 11 months of an audit, and we defended them throughout that process. But otherwise, it has been unwilling to allow a federal court to address this issue, which is why we're now recommending that Congress go ahead and fix that which was enacted over 60-plus years ago.
So why do you believe the IRS did not respond?
I think there could be it's all speculation. I think it could be a number of different things, but one thing is the IRS may recognize that it's on tenuous constitutional grounds. It probably does not want to have a federal judge actually examine the constitutional violations, both those that I've mentioned in my written testimony, but those that I did not. In addition to vagueness and free speech, the Johnson Amendment is constitutionally questionable in the areas of free exercise in the Establishment Clause, potentially even federal RFRA. So I think that would be one primary reason why the IRS might be reluctant to allow a court to look into this.
So you believe it is an unconstitutional code?
Absolutely. It's an unconstitutional code and frankly has no legitimate basis in law either, having been enacted as a political ploy.
Okay. Ms. Ancali, let me ask you about the vagueness aspect of the Johnson Amendment. How is that complicating the interpretation?
That's a great question. I'm sure you're very aware as a pastor of the fact that many activist organizations actually use that vagueness and the lack of consistency with how the IRS has enforced this statute to chill the speech of pastors, to threaten them into submission, essentially, scaring pastors out of making political statements generally, not just about political candidates, but about, as Mr. Connolly mentioned, moral issues and biblical issues that really affect the life of the church and the life of individual believers.
What about the accusation that somehow this, if it's repealed or changed in any way, the Johnson Amendment, that it would make churches become political action committees where dirty money could be laundered?
Well, the Free Speech Fairness Act is specific in that it doesn't allow more than de minimis incremental costs. So the de minimis factor is not related to the length of the statement, is not related to how many times the statement is made, but is related to the cost of the statement. So the whole purpose of that provision within the Free Speech Fairness Act, as I understand it, is to eliminate the ability for churches to become political action committees.
How would you respond to that, Ms. Holcomb?
I would absolutely agree. Look, the Free Speech Fairness Act is extremely simple. All it does is create a relief valve for free speech so that 501c3 organizations, particularly churches, which is my primary concern in this instance, would be allowed to once again fully exercise their First Amendment freedom to speak freely without having the IRS burst in through their church doors and censor their sermons.
So it's not legal for churches to give candidates, or is it?
No.
Give money to candidates?
Absolutely not.
And would that change?
It would not change. Free Speech Fairness Act does not in any way eviscerate current campaign finance laws. So those concerns really are not applicable in this context.
Okay, Ms. Engelbrecht, let me ask you, are you aware that the veterans organizations are also 501c3 organizations that are both tax exempt and receive charitable donations.
And there are all kinds of organizations that are C3s beyond just churches, and that's one of the reasons this is such a critical debate.
Okay, so my question here has to come with fairness of law. Is there a discrepancy in the way that different 501c3s are treated?
I would hope not. All I can say is, in our experience, the Johnson Amendment seemed to be a gateway to a type of abuse that I don't think any American citizen should have to endure, including visits from the domestic terrorism unit of the FBI, the repeated audits by the IRS, OSHA showing up, Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms showing up twice.
Well, let me ask Ms. Ann Colley or Ms. Holcomb, either one. There seems to me to be a broad discrepancy in the way 501c3s are treated here, and there's a direct discrimination.
I think that's exactly right, if I may jump in. You've got some 26 different organizations that are exempt under the IRS code. Only C3s have this explicit speech restriction. And frankly, it's unfair, and that's what the Free Speech Fairness Act is designed to do, is restore that fairness for all.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Now recognize the ranking member for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Despite the title of this hearing, the tax code does not constrain the freedom of speech of churches and other houses of worship. In fact, the majority has studiously avoided any extensive discussion of the real purpose of taking away the Johnson Amendment, which is to allow political money to enter the system through houses of worship. Rabbi Saperstein, churches and members of the clergy are free to speak out on any social issue, aren't they?
They are indeed.
And acting in their personal capacities, members of the clergy, like all members of houses of worship, can legally endorse or oppose political candidates. Isn't that true?
They can, they do. They can run for office. They can do anything politically that anyone else can do.
Certainly. In fact, acting in their personal capacities, members of the clergy, like all members of all houses of worship, can even serve as the treasurers of political campaigns or PACs, can't they?
Yes.
Now, let's be clear. The only thing that the current tax laws restrain is the use of churches to collect and funnel tax-deductible contributions from anonymous donors into political campaigns. Folks, churches and houses of worship have a special place in the tax code. They don't have to disclose their donors, and those donors can take deductions for their contributions to houses of worship. That is the special place that houses of worship have in our tax code. We have a rich history of churches and other houses of worship engaging in pressing social and moral issues. For example, Tony Perkins with the Family Research Council has eloquently written, and I quote, "Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke out forcefully from the pulpit on political matters that required change, and we are all glad he did so. It benefits all of us to have such change agents speaking freely from the pulpit. Since the birth of our nation, pastors and churches have been at the forefront of shaping public debate and our choice of public servants. What would America look like today had King or Reverend Lyman Beecher, a leading abolitionist, been muzzled by the IRS? Of course, the laws that the Family Research Council seeks to alter have been part of the tax code since 1954, before even the Montgomery bus boycott, which Dr. King helped to lead. Rabbi Saperstein, did tax laws prevent Dr. King from speaking out and standing up during the civil rights movement?
It certainly did not, and as I said, the Johnson Amendment was in effect the entire time.
And you're absolutely correct about that. Our tax laws do not restrain the freedom of speech. Perhaps that is why 99 faith and denominational groups wrote a letter to Congress opposing efforts to allow dark money to flow into American political campaigns through churches and charities. Now, let's be very clear what this hearing is about. It's about money, money, money. That is what this hearing is about. It is not about the restraint of free speech. I ask unanimous consent to insert into the record the statements from the following organizations. Statement of Tim Delaney on behalf of the National Council of Nonprofits. Statement of Amanda Tyler on behalf of the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty. Statement of Maggie Garrett on behalf of Americans United for Separation of Church and State. And finally, the statement of Michael Didora on behalf of Center for Inquiry.
Without objection, so ordered.
Now, folks, we all must remember the separation of church and state is foundational to our democracy. And the reason why houses of worship and churches and religious institutions have a special tax exemption under the code is because that we want to encourage folks to be able to donate to their churches and houses of worship and nonprofits to do good for our society and to do it in a nonpartisan, non-political way. People who are affiliated with these churches and houses of worship and nonprofits in their personal capacities can do whatever the heck they want politically, but they cannot use their resources, which have been derived in a tax-exempt way, from pursuing partisan political purposes. And that is something that's sacrosanct in our tax code, and that's what the vast majority of Americans believe in. Thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Now recognize another pastor. Gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Walker, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a privilege to be with you guys today. Thank you, panel, for coming out as well. I want to take some time to get to some questions, but just some of the comments that I hear, I feel like that need to be addressed. We stand for synagogues, temples, churches, so the misnomer that we heard earlier, this is just about churches, is certainly offensive to me. My friend Rabbi Fred Gutman in Greensboro, we don't agree many times politically, but he's one of my dearest friends. Rabbi Andy Korn was in my office yesterday, but I also stand for my friends Dr. Muhammad Faruqi, Shahzad Akbar, and those great people, not just because they're friends of mine, but because they have every right to speak according to their religious beliefs as anybody else. Another comment that was just recently mentioned was talking about a pastor as long as he is, I believe, operating in his personal capacity. And I thought about, once again, this is a place where what laymen, what pastors, what the American public, the rules they have to play by are so often different than what Congress gets to play by. In this capacity, if we were to endorse someone, it wouldn't be in our private. We would probably say, in any kind of billing, it would say Congressman so-and-so endorses so-and-so. And I just think it's kind of humorous that we put limitations as far as a pastor on what he can do if it's under the guise of the church. So-and-so is this pastor. Make sure he is saying that it's in his personal capacity as opposed to representing a certain church body. And Rabbi Saberstein, you had talked about a little bit earlier and talked about two people running in the same church. What would the pastor do? Two thoughts on that. One is local churches should have the autonomy to be able to make whatever decisions they believe as long as within the confines of the law. And I will tell you, as a former pastor, you talked about that being such a crisis, and as you've probably experienced as well. Crises are when you're in the room of somebody breathing their last breath and struggling to give words to a family. Crises are when you have a home falling apart and you're looking for guidance to be able to put that back together. I trust pastors to make the decisions well when it comes to the political in this capacity. So let me ask a couple questions, and I want to start with, and I was out, Ms. Ankal, is that the?
Nkai.
Nkai, okay, thank you for the pronunciation. The federal tax code, in regards to a tax-exempt charitable organization, among other things, must not participate in or intervene in, which is including publishing or distributing of statements, any political campaign on behalf or in opposition to any candidate for public office. Indirectly is a key word I want to focus on there. What does it mean to indirectly intervene in a campaign? And if you, a legal expert, can't tell me, how in the world are pastors supposed to know what kind of conduct is legal and what isn't?
That's a fabulous point, and that's exactly the point that I believe I and ADF is making today, is that the vagueness of these rules and regulations, the secrecy behind some of the regulations that the IRS uses to investigate churches and other nonprofit organizations is just baffling, and it's very difficult for attorneys and certainly lay people to understand.
Yeah, I don't think this fear is unfounded, whether it's your Hindu background, Muslim background, but I do find it very interesting that 81% of the American public, 81% of evangelicals voted for President Trump. This fear is real. It exists out there that there are some restrictions that are trending this direction. Another question I would have for you, you use the word chilling effect in your testimony. Can you describe how the Johnson Amendment has a chilling effect on speech?
Certainly, precisely because of the vagueness and the inconsistency with how the IRS applies the law, with whether the IRS is going to actually continue to apply the law in the same ways when the IRS imposes a penalty and then actually rescinds that penalty or refunds that penalty with interest. It causes a lot of confusion for pastors and leaders of nonprofit organizations, which is unfortunate, but is what causes a chilling effect because pastors are uncertain of how the Johnson Amendment will be applied to them. They, in fact, do not make political statements, not just about candidates, but about issues that do affect the church.
Yeah, I just had a meeting recently with about 50, 55 pastors. We do these breakfasts about once a month, and we invite all of our friends from different places, synagogues, temples, whatever it might be. One of the concerns they continue to bring up is this mass confusion as far as what they can and cannot say. It's very unclear. Ms. Holcomb, some believe an amended Johnson Amendment would politicize the 501c3 organizations, or in this case, synagogues, temples, or churches. Would nonprofit organizations be forced to stand in support or opposition to any political candidate?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you for that question. No, absolutely not. If you don't want to speak about these issues, you certainly do not have to. But right now, we have the heavy hand of government coming down on one side of this equation, saying that you may not. That's fundamentally a theological decision and should be left to the churches.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Go back.
The gentleman now recognize the gentlelady from the District of Columbia for her 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, if the heavy arm of government were coming down on ministers and rabbis, they're a very powerful institution. They would be here in our faces, and we haven't seen them. And I can't imagine why we now want to take the only part of American life that is not polarized and put it right into the thick of the ugliest part of our life. This is the religious institutions are the only institution I know not asking for taxes or a tax break. So now you want them up here essentially doing the same thing. It's interesting that none of the minority witnesses directly lead a rabbi, lead a church or a synagogue. But what the majority of witnesses want to do is to spread Citizens United to houses of worship. It's not about free speech. It's about political money. There's been great wisdom on the part of the framers and the Johnson Amendment in protecting our houses of worship, our political institutions, from the corrosive effects of political money. Of course, the churches and the synagogues and religious institutions have spoken for themselves, not asking for the money. So I don't know who in the world you think you represent. There is a repeal bill here offered by Congressman Heiss and Congressman Solis. I'd like you, Rabbi Saperstein, to listen to how they would frame it. Of course, it's churches, religious institutions, and charities. Remember that, charities, it's a wide open word. Partisan political activity would be allowed. If it is made in the ordinary course of an organization's regular and customary activities, that's the biggest hole I've seen that anybody has ever tried to write into law if you try to figure what a minister and a rabbi do every day. That results in the organization incurring not more than de minimis incremental expenses. Rabbi Saperstein, does that language, does that approach taken in this pending legislation allay the concerns you raised in your testimony?
Indulge me to make two very brief comments before responding. First, in the Tim Delaney letter that was put into the record here earlier, it represents 4,500 nonprofits. I checked briefly. It looks like there are nonprofits from each of the districts of the people who are here today on this. Secondly, I just had, Mr. Walker talked about Rabbi Koren. He's here because we brought 800 leaders in to advocate for policies that they were concerned about here. But at the same time, totally coincidentally, I see a group of Jewish women behind me who, with people, I'm sure each of your districts, wanted to get involved in electoral politics and created a Jewish Women's PAC. That's a national political action committee rather than doing it through their synagogues here. So what we're not sure of is what de minimis means here. The idea that endorsement, you're allowed to endorse someone, you can do it from the pulpit, you just can't do it with tax-deductible money and tax-exempt money. And that's the money that pays that salary of the person making the statement that underwrites the cost of the church.
Rabbi Saperstein, you and I know that some of the most political figures we know are ministers and rabbis. And they don't feel that they can't speak out. Often they are leaders, and indeed the ones that make us understand what we have to do up here. That's why you don't see them sitting as a whole crowd or room with people with collars on saying, please change the law. How about the de minimis standard? Do you think the language I quoted to you before would start us down a slippery slope?
I have no idea. I posed that question to Mr. Heiss before. I don't know what it means. It will be as vague as the current standards and will not help at all. And I think it will open up a Pandora's box that we will deeply regret. And Representative Norton, my colleagues can correct me if I'm wrong, I don't know a single major national denomination that is calling for the repeal of the Johnson Amendment here. Overwhelmingly, the polls show 90% of clergy do not want this touch, that they feel it protects their religious
That's
freedom.
why I don't know who the majority witnesses could possibly represent. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentlelady for her question. We'll now turn to the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Grothman.
Just a general question. I have heard ministers say that people in churches say that either the ministers are not speaking out because they're afraid of the Johnson Amendment on a variety of issues that they're afraid to talk about. Deep down inside, do you think the biggest problem we have is, as far as ministers not speaking out on certain issues, is it the Johnson Amendment or is it cowardice on the part of the ministers? It's a big issue. It's a huge issue.
Yeah, I'll just mention that I know that every election cycle activist organization send letters to churches. My church back in Georgia received these letters every year, threatening to turn them into the IRS. And especially to smaller churches, this is a significant threat. They don't have tax experts and tax lawyers in their churches that can step up to the plate and provide defenses and guidance through audits and two-year investigations. And so I do think that it's a significant threat. The Johnson Amendment is a significant threat to pastors.
What's the bigger problem? Is it the Johnson Amendment, or when ministers tell me they can't speak out on abortion, or can't speak out on gay issues, or can't speak out on premarital sex? Is the bigger problem the Johnson Amendment, or is it cowardice on the part of the clergy?
Well, I'm actually also very glad that you asked that question because, in fact, Family Research Council has a significant church ministries team, and there are a number of pastors from those churches from around the country that are heavily engaged in the political process, both on the local and the national level. And I'm here representing, some of those churches that are a part of our church ministries team. And so I do think that many pastors would like to be more engaged and are just not sure how they can do that with the Johnson Amendment intact.
Ms. Engelbrecht, Ms. Holcomb, do you have any comments on that?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I appreciate the question. I think it's a false dichotomy. It's kind of a question of which comes first. Alliance Defending Freedom receives hundreds of calls every year from pastors across the country who want to know what the legal boundaries of the Johnson Amendment are and what they can and cannot legally do. Again, they're law-abiding citizens. They don't want to risk the IRS intrusion into their pulpits and ministries. And so they're trying to be very careful and cautious about how they go about leading their congregations and navigating these moral issues. And so it's so important that we deal with the issue of the Johnson Amendment so that pastors, again, feel at liberty to, as they did for the first 200 years of American history, guide their people in all aspects of life.
The other option would be for all of us to simply tell them what they're entitled to do, entitled to speak out on all of these things, so long as they don't endorse candidates and use money for partisan political purposes. Pretty simple concept here. And all of those letters you get, we could just tell them what they're allowed to do and empower them to do it.
Yeah, well, this is a fine bill. I'm not sure it's the biggest problem we face in the clergy today. But Ms. Engelbrecht, I'll give you a question.
Well, oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. You can respond to my last.
You know, I am a leader.
Or harmed by the Johnson Amendment?
Absolutely.
Could you list them?
Well, sadly, I don't have the list with me, but I would say that America got a first glimpse when the BOLO list, Be on the Lookout list, came out in the USA Today, I believe it was, that listed over 200 groups that had been singled out for investigation by the IRS.
Okay, thank you very much.
I thank the gentleman. Rabbi, do you, and let's just talk in the abstract first, do you think that government can, in fact, have a chilling effect on individual liberties?
I do.
And then let's get specific. Do you think the government can have a chilling effect on people's First Amendment free speech liberties?
I do.
Yeah, and part of that is driven by what we've heard from the other witnesses, the vagueness of the Johnson Amendment. Do you agree with that? Vagueness of the Johnson Amendment. Every election year, countless number of churches, typically evangelical churches, get letters from the left. Is that right, Ms. Holcomb?
That is
letters
correct.
from left-leaning organizations say, hey, 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 be careful. Big Brother's watching.
Does that have to do with the ambiguity, or does that have to do with their endorsing candidates?
No, it has to do with the fact organizations are sending them a letter and the vagueness of this law.
Saying in the past you've endorsed candidates and you shouldn't do that.
Saying
The Johnson
whether-
Amendment and the law is clear.
Saying-
Don't do it.
Saying whether it's true or not. My colleague from the District of Columbia mentioned just a few minutes ago the heavy arm of government. If anyone knows about the heavy arm of government, my guess is it's Ms. Engelbrecht, right? If I get this right, looking at your fact pattern, the two organizations you were involved in forming, True the Vote and King Street Patriots, back in 2010, you applied for your tax-exempt status, right?
Correct.
And after 2010, for the next 3 years, if I counted this up right, you got 6 phone calls or visits by the FBI.
Correct.
Twice you were visited by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. OSHA stopped by to say hello. The Texas EPA stopped by to say hello. The ranking member of this full committee sent you letters, went on national television, and criticized you and your organization. And just to add insult to injury, 8 times the IRS contacted you and audited you both personally and in your business. Is that accurate?
That's accurate, and I would add to that all the while, our 501c3 application was in play. At any point, the IRS could have said, thumbs up or thumbs down, you either meet the criteria or you don't, but they used it for what over time began to feel like opposition
Did you feel a little
research.
nervous? Did that chill some of the activities that True the Vote and King Street Patriots might want to get involved in?
Absolutely.
Would you agree with that, Rabbi? That would probably have a chilling effect on any organization who had to be 8 contacts from the IRS, 6 from the FBI. Again, finding nothing wrong. She didn't do anything wrong. She was just waiting on a pending application.
The application of any of these rules should never depend on the content of what is happening here. That is a principle I hope we all agree on.
So let me ask you a question, Ms. Holcomb, because, well, let me go back to Ms. Engelbrecht. Did the IRS ask for anything specific? Did they ask, like, what you're doing in these meetings, the content of what you were doing? Did they do that?
Yes, sir. They asked for copies of every tweet I'd ever tweeted, every Facebook posting I'd ever posted, everywhere I'd spoken since the inception of the organization, and to whom, and what I said. And they asked for any advanced scheduling for the next 2 years. There was no doubt in my mind that they were looking to censor my speech.
So if that's not the heavy arm of government chilling First Amendment liberties, I don't know what is. I mean, I don't know what is. Ms. Holcomb, have pastors ever had the government ask for the content of their sermons? Has that ever happened?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, unfortunately, it has. One extremely notorious
And it happened in
Houston.
Miss Engelbrecht's state,
It
right?
did.
Not too far from where she lives. Imagine that.
That's exactly right. The mayor of Houston subpoenaed the sermons of 5 local pastors, all because they had simply spoken out and preached about their biblical views on human sexuality.
They hadn't endorsed a candidate, had they?
They had not endorsed a candidate whatsoever.
They hadn't opposed a candidate.
They had
It was
not.
about an issue, wasn't it?
It was about an issue.
Issues central to their tenets, their beliefs.
That's exactly right.
Think that chills speech, Rabbi?
I don't know the circumstances, but my answer is going to be yes.
Yeah, of course
A mayor shouldn't be asking for the content of this. There may be facts, but just because
On a central issue, a
But-
social issue that is central to the beliefs of those individuals at that church, that the mayor, I mean, the heavy arm of government, the mayor of a city of several million people, Houston, if I remember right, Ms. Holcomb, asked for the content. You just said earlier we shouldn't be doing that. So this is what happens, and this is why Mr. Heiss's legislation is so important, and this issue is so important.
But the question is, are there times legitimately that speech can be regulated here? And you quoted Virginia v. Hicks before. Did I hear you correctly, Mr. Heiss?
That I did what?
You quoted Virginia v. Hicks, the Supreme Court case. So in that case, Justice Scalia said, there comes a point at which the chilling effect of an overbroad law, significant though it might be, cannot justify prohibiting all enforcement of the law. And I think that this law
Well,
works in a
that's-
proper way, the Johnson Amendment,
you may
to
think that,
say
but
you
the-
just can't have this speech with government subsidies.
I respectfully disagree, and so do a lot of other Americans, and that's why we're having this hearing. And what we know is it did happen. It happened. The heavy arm of government asking for content for sermons that pastors preach regarding an issue, not endorsing candidates.
You and I agree on this.
And the slippery slope that my colleague also talked about is pretty darn slippery when you view it in the context that Ms. Engelbrecht knows firsthand. When you view it in the context of the very organization charged with administering this amendment, this law, the Johnson Amendment, was caught systematically for a sustained period of time, in Ms. Engelbrecht's situation, 7 years, harassing groups, keeping them in limbo, chilling their activities because they didn't like their political beliefs. Unbelievable that happened in the United States. Unbelievable. And we also know what took place in Houston, where the government was saying, we want pastor sermons. You got to be kidding me. And to say that we don't need this and to say, oh, it's about campaign finance, it's not. It's about no law abridging freedom of speech, the plain language of the First Amendment.
I'm sorry, and endorsing candidates will help that situation?
I didn't say that. I'm talking about the example here. But frankly, that's free speech too. But what I'm talking about is I'm talking about what took place in Texas.
And
I'm
they
talking
have
about
that
what took
speech.
place in Houston.
They just don't have the right to have a government subsidy for that speech. That's the only restriction.
Ms. Ankai, you were
If you-
just
if
dying
you-
to get in, and then I'll have to move on to
I'm very
our
excited
next,
to chime in on this topic, if you don't mind, because a church does not receive government subsidies. A church is tax exempt, and that's because churches and these charities, these nonprofit organizations are giving out more than $1 trillion,
Well said,
a
well
recent
said.
study said, in goods and services. So the idea that churches are subsidized by the government is inaccurate at best.
But you know as well as I do that in the
Rabbi, thank you.
Regan case, that Justice Rehnquist wrote the opinion. I quoted Justice Scalia before. Another liberal judge, Justice Rehnquist, held that these are subsidies, and that is the law of the land right now, right?
I don't think many churches think they're getting subsidies from their parishioner. I think they're getting
And I believe that if a church
a
did receive
tithe from
government
their
subsidies,
parishioners because they believe in the work that they are doing in that church and the ministry they are receiving, and the ministry they are giving to their community and to the families who worship there. That's what it is. It's not a subsidy from the government, for goodness sake. With that, I'll recognize my good friend, the ranking member from the great state of Virginia.
Thank you.
Knows something about the First Amendment, that founding colony and all
That's
that.
right.
God bless you, brother. You're up.
I thank you. And we even know something about religious freedom because I also come from Massachusetts, where and of course, Mr. Jefferson and Mr. Madison, both of whom came from my state of Virginia, believed in a pretty strong firewall between church and state. Mr. Madison, for example, took on a lot of unpopular religious causes to fight for the religious freedom of Anabaptists, because the state religion as a colony was the Church of England. And it was not a popular cause, although it helped him beat James Monroe for the first congressional election, but that's a different story, because the Anabaptists came out in droves to support him. So we have a little bit of history in the Commonwealth of Virginia. I remember going to Williamsburg for mock trial, but from an original verbatim, and again was surprised to learn, Rabbi Saperstan, that Catholics were not welcome on the jury. And we could be fined if we refused to go to Sunday services at the Church of England because of the political dominance of that particular denomination. For some reason, they were a little more squishy about Jews. Apparently, Jews could maybe kind of sort of sometimes serve in a jury, but not us. What could go wrong with, I mean, this is just First Amendment rights. We're stifling churches and other religious institutions. Although we only, in our title, talked about church, I hope you didn't feel left out. But if we repealed the Johnson administration, it would be more than churches affected, would it not, rabbis?
The damage that can be done is to bring our corrosive, divisive, partisan splits in this country into one of the few institutions that people with different political, ideological, even religious differences are able to come together in community and comity. It is why the denominations want this protection. It is why 90% of clergy want this protection. The damage is it can flood. If you got a choice between, think of the hundreds of millions of dollars that went into political campaigns, if you have a choice of getting a tax deduction for it, now this doesn't apply to your version, but in repealing the Johnson Amendment of hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars going in and getting a tax deduction or not, you're going to be flooding the churches. I don't want to have Republican churches and Democratic churches, Republican mosque and Democratic mosque here. And bringing partisan politics into this is going to damage this.
Individual entity, Muslim, Hindu, Jewish, Christian, could voluntarily say, you know, I'm going to give up the tax deduction, the tax exemption, and do my thing.
It can, and there are some who do it. I gave the example of a group of Jewish women here who created a Jewish Women's PAC that's very effective and very respected across the country because they wanted to do it freely and without dividing their congregations.
So, far from being a matter of the exercise of free speech, it's really about your tax status. And if you really want to engage in that kind of partisan political activity and accept donations, why not just give up your tax exemption?
No, it's not giving up your tax exemption. You would remain tax exempt. Here, you would create a C4 that would create a PAC.
Or
it just means that there are no tax deductible funds.
So there's no impediment to forming a 501c4 or another entity for that purpose if they wanted to.
Correct.
Is that correct?
Correct.
the IRS and taking
Well,
forever to give you the.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, I've still got my time. So what's wrong with doing that, Rabbi? Sir? Why wouldn't people want to do that instead of repealing the Johnson administration, which gets us into this real thicky mess and frankly is going to, I think, create enormous division in the faith community in America?
We ask what's wrong with that. Legally, there's nothing wrong with it. If I had my druthers, I'd much rather do it the way those women sitting in the back of the room did, create an entirely different entity that brings those religious people together to do it and keep it away from the houses of worship altogether. But legally, they have the right to do it.
All righty, my time's up. Thank you all for being here.
And I've just asked unanimous consent to submit into the record a statement from the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, which is part of the Southern Baptist denomination, expressing their support for Mr. Heiss's legislation. Without objection, would so ordered.
In the
And now
spirit,
let's go.
in the spirit of the First Amendment, we have no objection.
Okay, I appreciate it. God bless you. Mr. Meadows, the gentleman from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the gentleman from Georgia for his leadership. Ms. Holcomb, we're not asking for tax-exempt political donations to be made available to every church in America, are we?
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, no, we absolutely are not, and thank you for the opportunity to clarify. The Free Speech Fairness Act, again, is very simple, simply a relief valve for speech. It does not eviscerate current campaign finance laws. If contributions and expenditures are already regulated, no, look, all we're talking about, again, is a pastor's freedom to speak freely from the pulpit, and it's a complete misnomer to think that we're just talking about candidate endorsements here. No, politics has intruded on moral issues. So we're talking about a pastor's freedom to address issues like the sanctity of human life, like marriage, without fear of IRS retribution.
So this whole narrative that talks about dark money going to churches in order to actually support candidates that may or may not be there is not only a red herring, but it is a red herring of unbelievable crimson red. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Respectfully and politely, it's fear-mongering. It is not what is at issue here. And frankly, if we would like to discuss history, it was raised earlier, pastors for the first 200 years of American history had this freedom. They exercised it responsibly. The Johnson Amendment was not enacted in order to address any issue with churches. Frankly, it does not appear Senator Johnson was even aware it would apply to them.
Well, so Ms. Holcomb, would you not agree that in this very Capitol building that we have clergy who have statues erected in their honor for what they've done for the founding of our country and battling for those religious liberties, and they were the clergy that came from the pulpit. And I would suggest that those political interventions, maybe before we had the IRS, the long arm of the IRS reaching in to Ms. Engelbrecht and others, but did they not? The clergy was not without a voice from the very founding of this Judeo-Christian nation.
That's exactly right. And they spoke out on the most important issues of the day, including the Revolutionary War, civil rights, so on and so forth. But if I may, I'd like to also address one of these other accusations that I've heard tossed around here, that it's divisive to churches. With all due respect, that's quite paternalistic. Churches are more than capable of handling their own issues without the heavy hand of government coming in and trying to prevent division within the church. Now, these are fundamentally theological decisions that should be made within the church body itself.
Well, I thank you for clarifying that. Mr. Saperstein, Rabbi, I will come to you. You and I go way back, and we have a passion on a number of areas. We happen to disagree in terms of your premise here today and mine. So let me put it in a vernacular that perhaps I can share from a Christian perspective on what I'm hearing from many of our pastors that may translate a little bit closer to home. Some have suggested that I'm so pro-Israel that I make Bibi Netanyahu look moderate. And so you know that my passion for Israel is genuine in the
I
Jewish
do
people.
indeed.
And so I say that if a rabbi with a tax-exempt status starts to get involved in any political discussions that may not have to do with marriage or life, but let's say it gets involved in Palestinian versus Jewish, or who should be a leader, or that we should make sure that we elect more pro-Jewish members of Congress. Do you think that that should be permitted in a synagogue?
I think that right exists right now all across America.
I agree. I agree it does. I agree it exists. But do you believe that it should be there? Not that it exists.
Yes.
So, based on that premise, anything that would provide for a chilling event that suggests that I should support a candidate that is more pro-Israel, would you not think that that should be across the board on any denomination or any religion?
I'm actually confused. Forgive me.
I was hoping that you would be.
Here, I'm confused as to whether you're talking about the issue or...
I'm talking about the issue. So let me tell you what's happening is that we've gone to a narrative that would suggest that we want churches to be political endorsers and money pots for others. And that's not really what we're talking about. What we want them to be able to do is have the ability, and I think you and I agree on this, to have the ability of free speech to direct from the pulpit without fear of retribution or losing their tax-exempt status, deeply held religious beliefs that you and I both will seek to defend. And that's what we're trying to get at here today. And so what I look forward to from you is some suggestions on how we can do that. And I'm willing to put a prohibition on monies going through 501c3s to make sure, but if we take this very far, we're going to have a chilling effect on free speech. And I'm sure that's not what you want.
You said this was a red herring. If, put aside Mr. Heiss's proposal here.
I don't know that you can, but go ahead.
If we simply undo the Johnson Amendment, is it not clear that then nonprofits would be able to give money into political, and because churches have exemptions from reporting 990s here in contributions on it, there would be this dark money that would flow through that. Either you take away the exemptions from the church, God forbid, or you actually allow it to continue, and churches, religious institutions alone, here would have the ability to fund things without it being transparent. Is that not a valid concern?
I think it is a logical fallacy. I mean, I'll just speak bluntly, and I think that's a logical fallacy, but I'm willing to have the debate, and I guess what I'm saying, Rabbi, is this. If you will come to this committee with ways to protect free speech, you will have someone who is very willing to make sure that a 501c3's tax-exempt status does not get used from the pulpits and other areas of worship. Sound fair? Will you get those recommendations?
That's how I began. I think we differ on whether that free speech exists today or not.
We do differ on that, and I'll yield back.
Real quickly before turning to Mr. Raskin, Ms. Holcomb, can a church contribute to a political candidate's campaign today?
No.
No. And if the Johnson Amendment is gone, would a church be able to contribute to a political candidate's campaign?
Look, we're talking about the Free Speech Fairness Act. No, absolutely not.
No, but they could be able to speak, right? I mean, that's all we're talking about. They could be
all.
able to exercise their First Amendment liberty where it says Congress shall not abridge freedom of speech. That's all would happen. Oh, wow, imagine that. We'd actually have the First Amendment the way it's supposed to be. Mr. Raskin.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much and for waving me in and allowing me to participate in the hearing. I want to start with just two questions of nomenclature. One is the so-called Johnson Amendment was, of course, introduced by Senator Johnson, but it passed on a bipartisan, overwhelming bipartisan basis in a Republican Congress and signed into law by President Eisenhower. So this has been standard American law for what it's called. With all due respect, the First Amendment doesn't need a Fairness Act. The First Amendment is supreme to any statute we might pass. The First Amendment is its own Fairness Act. If someone's violating the First Amendment, go and sue under the First Amendment. So let me start with that. Are any of you aware of any constitutional litigation since 1954 in the last 60-plus years challenging the so-called Johnson Amendment or the Eisenhower Amendment as unconstitutional and what its success has been? And forgive me for going fast, but we just have so little time. Are you aware of any, have you ever brought a case on it or no?
I'll defer to Ms. Holcomb.
Okay, Ms. Engelbrecht, are you aware of any decision striking it down?
Not any decisions, no, but we sued the IRS in 2013 just to
But
prove
okay,
this
Ms.
point.
Holcomb.
Mr. Chairman, members
yeah.
of the committee, we cannot affirmatively sue the IRS due to federal law.
Wait,
The Anti-Injunction Act, we are not allowed pursuant to federal law.
the anti-injunction has to do with federal spending.
We can't, no, I respectfully disagree.
Wait,
we cannot
you're saying a
affirm-
church cannot sue the federal government?
We cannot, without having been penalized, come out and sue the IRS to challenge the constitutionality of the Johnson Amendment. Happy to provide you with brief.
Okay, well, let's discuss it. Rabbi Saperstein, are you aware
That's
of it?
that's what the Branch Ministries case was, wasn't it? with
Respectfully
challenges?
disagree once again. No, that's not the
Okay.
case whatsoever.
All right, we'll have to,
Branch Ministries,
we'll have
I
to
would be
litigate it
glad
out.
to clarify.
In any event, I was a little surprised to hear this repeatedly described as an unconstitutional law that's in the United States of America. There are churches that win suits all the time in the U.S. Supreme Court. But, okay, let me ask you this. Have any of you as private citizens ever been stifled in your own political speech, your ability to go out and say you believe X, Y, or Z for moral, religious, philosophical, or political reasons? Have any of you ever been restrained in your speech or your spending?
Respectfully, sir, I'm not a church or a nonprofit.
Okay, as a citizen, I was asking you. As a citizen, have you ever been stifled because of your religious views? Okay, so let me ask you, were you going to say, Ms. Engelbrecht, have you?
Well, you qualified at the end based on religious views, and I would just say that in my instance, I was interested in the advancement of election integrity, and that seemed to draw the ire of a great many federal agencies. And yes, I do believe that I was being suppressed because of my speech.
Okay, well, and at a certain point, I'd love to talk to you about that. I actually have some family history with this. My father, who worked in President Kennedy's administration, was on Nixon's enemies list, and the IRS went after him. So there's abuse of government all the time. But what we're here to talk about is the law, and what is the law going to be? So let me ask you this. Do all of you agree that corporations and citizens should not be able to funnel dark money through churches in order to get into political campaigns? Like if I wanted to support the Mark Meadows for President campaign, hypothetically speaking, I should not be able to give $10 million to a church to go out and spend that money on an anonymous basis. Do all of you agree, or do some of you think that is First Amendment protected? Any answers on that?
Respectfully, sir, it's currently prohibited by law, and the Free Speech Fairness Act does not change that.
No, I understand, but I'm a law professor, so don't fight the hypothetical. Imagine a world without hypotheticals. What I'm saying is, do you think it's constitutional for us to prevent people from channeling money through churches on an anonymous, dark basis to put into political campaigns? Is that a First Amendment problem or not?
Clearly, yes.
You think it's constitutional to ban that? Do you believe it's constitutional to ban it?
Respectfully, again, that's just not what's at issue here.
Okay,
And
do you guys think it's constitutional to ban conduit contributions through churches to political candidates?
In my statement, we have endorsed the Free Speech Fairness Act, and that's what we're advocating for, and that's what we're here to advocate for today. And like Ms. Holcomb said, that's not the intent of the Free Speech Fairness Act.
Okay. Well, it was fascinating to me that it was something like 90 or 100 religious organizations or churches have come to lobby against this. In other words, on the terms that I heard described before, they're here to lobby against, theoretically, their own free expression rights, and it doesn't make any sense to me. But I think that what they perceive is that the repeal of the so-called Johnson Amendment is an attempt to open up a gaping hole in the law for super divine dark money to pour through into the political system. And if it's not, then it should be very explicitly amended to say that nobody should be able to give money to a church for the purposes of putting it into a political campaign. If all of this is about is somebody being able to say what they want from the pulpit, I guess I'm with Rabbi Saperstein, I haven't seen any evidence that that's actually in danger. But do any of you have any cases where somebody has not been able to state their political views from the pulpit?
I'll just say that I was actually very excited to hear the statement of the ERLC, which is the policy arm of the Southern Baptist Convention, one of the largest denominations in this country, and they actually do support the Free Speech Fairness Act.
Wait. My question is, are you aware of any IRS persecution or prosecution of anybody for making a political statement at the pulpit?
Yes, absolutely so. All Saints Episcopal Church was one example provided. It is also my written testimony. But respectfully, I would just like to point out, we don't silence the minority just based on the whim of the majority. So we're going to do what's right. And there are pastors across the country asking for this relief from Congress right now.
Yeah, okay. Well, we seem to have differences to the facts, because some people seem to think that the First Amendment's working great, that the Johnson Amendment has worked great for decades, and we seem to have a difference as to values. Some people believe that churches are actually much better off not being able to be dragged into TV soundbite wars and negative advertising. And others think that that's perfectly fine, that churches should be involved there. But let me ask you this. If a church does want to get involved, it can set up a C4 right now. It's just that it can't receive tax-deductible contributions to do it. Is that right?
Respectfully, churches aren't asking for C4s. All they want is just to be able to freely apply Scripture to every aspect of life without having the IRS on their backs, censoring
Ms.
their
Holcomb,
speech.
do you believe a church can freely apply millions of dollars of dark money contributions to advance its view of Scripture in the political process?
That's not what they're asking for.
But I'm
No,
asking you,
certainly
do
not.
you believe that millions of dollars should be able to be channeled through churches?
Time of the gentleman has expired.
All right, saved by the bell.
Gentlelady can
Thanks.
respond if she would like. You weren't really saved by the bell. You were given 1 minute and 40 seconds past the bell.
Respectfully, I will just point out yet again that campaign finance laws are in place that address those concerns. The Free Speech Fairness Act does not eviscerate those campaign finance laws, and that's simply not what America's pastors are asking for. Thank you.
Ms. Engelbrecht, Professor Raskin asked about stifling of free speech. He qualified it, as you said, based on your religious beliefs. But certainly there was an attempt by the government to stifle your free speech rights, so much so that, and I don't know if the professor was here for your testimony and for some of the earlier questioning, 8 visits from the IRS, 6 visits from the FBI, 2 visits from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. OSHA visited your business. Texas EPA visited your business. Letter from Mr. Cummings, a couple letters from Mr. Cummings, and TV appearances where he specifically called you and your organizations out. All this happens, coincidentally, right after you file for tax-exempt status for King Street Patriots and True the Vote. Why do you think that? I mean, that's an awful lot of government getting involved in your life and coming after you and looking into what's going on. And if that doesn't have a chilling effect and a stifling effect, and if that's not the heavy arm of government, I don't know what is. Why do you think that happened? Why did they do it?
I think it happened because they saw the Johnson Amendment as a gateway through which they could attempt to silence those who dissented from their perspectives.
So you think it happened because they just didn't like your point of view? You think that was the main reason?
I think that was the primary reason, yes. They saw a pro-liberty election integrity organization growing and growing quickly, and they wanted it gone.
Yeah. So I would actually say it's a little more than that, frankly, respectfully. I would say it's not just that they didn't like what you were speaking out about, that they didn't just disagree with your political point of view. They did it because you were effective, right?
Absolutely.
Because you were making a difference, right? You were focused on election integrity and like, whoa, we can't have that. We disagree with this speech, and oh, by the way, she's having an impact. Imagine that. And they said, time out, time for the heavy arm of government.
That's right.
Right? And now we know in your same town, pastors, the heavy arm of government weighed in on them and said, hey, by the way, you're tax exempt, you can preach what you want, you can have your church, but can you send us your sermons? We, the government, want to look at what you're preaching on Sunday? Are you kidding me?
And I can tell you, having lived through that in Houston, Texas, when that happened in our churches, it turned the community upside down.
Sure did. Sure did.
Would the chairman
I'm going to give the gentleman from Georgia around here, and then if the professor would like another short round, then we'll let our witnesses be dismissed and close the hearing.
Thank
Gentleman
you.
from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I do have a letter that came out last Congress by a host of organizations supporting the Free Speech Fairness Act and for the Johnson Amendment. I'd ask unanimous consent for it to be added, included in the record. And I find great offense that we continue hearing that this is all about laundering dirty money through the churches. That nothing can be further. It's nothing but fear mongering, and it's false. It's shameful. This is about free speech, and there are laws to prevent laundering, and nothing in that regard changes. Rabbi, have you ever endorsed a candidate from your synagogue?
No.
Okay. Have you ever received a threatening letter from the IRS for
No.
whatever you said in your synagogue?
No.
Okay. I have. I've received a number of them, and I've received them before I ever endorsed a candidate from the pulpit, and they are intimidating. They are threatening. They tell me that I can be sued, that my church can be sued, that we can lose tax-exempt status if I address certain issues from the pulpit.
The IRS sent such a letter?
No, I receive them from left-wing organizations that are proclaiming what the IRS has the right to do. And whether it's coming from the IRS or not, the fact is those letters are chilling, and they distort a very vague Johnson Amendment that is being used as a bully pulpit to self-censor people right out of involvement from our, and the fact that you have not received the letter says to me you have no business even addressing what the content of those letters consist of. It's amazing and ironic to me that people here today who claim to be supporters of the separation of the church and state are the very ones demanding that the government censor what's said in churches. And it's contradictory in every sense of the word. It ought to be the pastor, it ought to be the church that has a right to determine what is spoken from the pulpit, not the government. When government starts determining the content of sermons, we are in major trouble. So let's go back to the basics, the bird's eye view of why we're here today. Ms. Holcomb, I don't know who to address this to, so y'all just chime in, but let's go relatively quickly. The purpose why the Johnson Amendment came about in the first place, was it enacted to stop political speech from political opponents?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, it was designed as a political ploy by then Senator Lyndon Johnson to shut down 2 secular nonprofits.
There we go. That was the purpose. And I made the quote from the IRS itself acknowledging. That's the purpose. Right there is the purpose. That is why we're here today. It is because the Johnson Amendment was enacted for the distinct purpose of silencing political opponents who happen to be leading nonprofit organizations. That's why we're here. And that, over 60 years ago, has now become a massive tool of intimidation for 501c3 organizations, and that precisely is what, it's not about money, it's about free speech, it's about deliberately, purposefully, intentionally trying to silence the beliefs in the public square of those who are in nonprofit 501c3 organizations, and that must change. That is unconstitutional, that is un-American, and it needs to change. All right. The importance of 501c3 organizations in our society. In 10, 15 seconds, how important are they?
They're very important, and I was just going to mention that a recent study showed that 501c3 organizations provide more than $1 trillion a year in the United States alone in goods and services. These are to people in need. 501c3 organizations are very important, and they're not subsidized by the government. They're actually giving a lot to the American people.
Ms. Engelbrecht, you mentioned in your testimony that 501c3s are an endangered species. Can you elaborate?
Absolutely. I started my organization in a time when there were many organizations being started in pursuit of liberty and trying to, in ways that had not been seen for years, engage citizens in political speech and in the ability to speak freely. And when the IRS began singling groups out, that shut down, and it hasn't come back. It hasn't come back like it was, because who wants to be put through that? I'm still in court. Who wants that? That's why the Johnson Amendment has to be repealed, replaced. Something has to be done, because we don't want that stain on the fabric of our country.
Mr. Chairman, I would just say perhaps we ought to add 501c3s to the endangered species list, because I agree with you wholeheartedly, and it'd be the one time that I would support the endangered species list. But thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you, Jody, and thank you, our Congressman Heiss, for all your great work over not just in Congress, over the years on this important important issue. I just want to ask a couple questions here again to Ms. Engelbrecht. So I want you to tell this committee, and for the record, just what it feels like. Oh, yeah, I'm coming back to you, yeah. Just what it feels like when you get 8 contacts from the FBI, 6 from the IRS, 2 from the BATF, OSHA, EPA. You have an important member, influential member, ranking member of Congress go on TV, say things about you personally, send you letters. What's that feel like?
It's terrifying. And for 2 years, I didn't tell anybody because there was such a stigma that I felt would be associated. And we were already trying hard enough to get our C3. So we were being held in limbo.
I'm just on the personal, emotional
but on
side
on
of
the
things.
personal and emotional side, it was terrifying.
Yep.
And I didn't see it coming because I knew what our motives were, and that was just to get citizens to engage in the electoral process.
But you were just starting a local Tea Party group.
Just starting a local group to say, you know, we're not enough volunteers in the polls. Let's encourage people to go
When you
and
filled out
serve.
that application and sent it in, did you even
No,
never cross your mind, did it?
no,
No idea this was going to happen.
no.
And suddenly, the heavy arm of government, as Ms. Holmes Norton talked about, is all over the Engelbrecht family.
Yeah. Yes. I'll say, if I may, one of the quotes that I held dearest during that time was from Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who said, "Not to act is to act, and not to speak is to speak." And that is what made me realize that I had to stand up and speak. It's, I suspect, very similar to what the churches try to do when they get together collectively and speak out in defiance of the Johnson Amendment.
Yeah. I imagine there were some pastors in your neighborhood who saw what you were going through, and they had to kind of wonder, man, maybe I better tone it down a little bit next Sunday, right?
Without question.
Good
Without
pastors won't. They're going to preach, but some of them, it was probably in the back of their mind, I'm guessing.
Absolutely, or other group leaders who would come up to me and say, I don't want to go through what you're going through. We're going to shut this thing
Right,
down.
and you weren't the only conservative group
No,
around the country.
one
There
of
were
hundreds.
hundreds.
One of hundreds.
Hundreds. Ms. Holcomb, I bet you've had clients who had to go through the same kind of experience Ms. Engelbrecht went through, right?
We most certainly have. And again, we hear from pastors all across the country who are fearful of going through that process. Look, we can't trust the IRS with emails. What are we doing trusting it with our fundamental First Amendment freedoms?
All right, Mr. Raskin, we're going to give you the last word, and you can have as much time as you want.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so much. And this has been a very clarifying hearing, and I want to thank Mr. Heiss especially for his comments. I want to start with that. Mr. Heiss is very reassuring to me. He disclaims any interest in creating a divine dark money loophole in the law. This is not about George Soros being able to channel millions of dollars from a not-for-profit through churches or synagogues or mosques into politics. It's not about allowing the Koch brothers to put hundreds of millions of dollars into churches on an anonymous, undisclosed basis in order to make that money tax deductible. Okay, so everybody agrees that, at least let me say, do all of you agree you'd have no problem with an amendment to his bill saying that nothing here assures nothing here gives anybody the right to put any money into a church for the purposes of spending in a political campaign? Would all of you agree?
Sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
With all due respect, I think that separation of church and state just means that the government should stay out of churches. And I think that churches should be able to do what they want to do and the way they want to do it, and the moral fiber of that church and the leaders of the church and all religious institutions should be allowed to do what they want to do.
Okay, so if I'm a church, I'm the Jim Jones church, whatever his church was called. I can have people give me millions of dollars of money that's tax deductible for them, and I'm tax exempt, and then I can go out and say, let's elect Ms. Holcomb to Congress, or let's defeat Ms. Holcomb for Congress, and there's no problem with that, and I can recruit people to give me money for those purposes. Is that right, just on your view?
I would say that, I would hope, that the true north of any religious institution or nonprofit would stand clear in their
But it's up to
purpose.
them. We agree under the First Amendment. They define their religion as they want. I've got the religion of dark money. That's my religion. In America, you can create whatever religion you want, right? So my religion is I want to collect dark money and put it into a campaign and save my donors having to pay taxes on it. So that's okay on your view. I understand Ms. Ankali's not there. I think Ms. Holcomb's with me on this. I think Rabbi Saperstein's with me on this. You would like an amendment which says we're going to prevent a dark money loophole from emerging. But you think that that's guaranteed by the First Amendment?
I recognize that this is a difficult situation, but in my experience, less government is always better.
Let me ask you about your situation, because forgive me, I had another meeting and I missed it. But you're not a church. Your 501c3 is secular, right? There's nothing religious about it, right?
Correct.
Okay, so whatever rights you're asserting for yourself, either constitutionally or as a matter of policy, would go for the United Way or Harvard University or Liberty University, right? In other words, Harvard University could say, not only do we think we've got the smartest people in the country here, we're going to take money out of Harvard's corporate treasury, which is, I think, $17 billion now, and put it into political campaigns to support people for president or U.S. Senate or governor, and you've got no problem with that, right? You think that's their right as a 501c3 organization.
I do not profess to be an expert on whether or not repealing the Johnson Amendment would have such a global impact.
I'm just asking on your views about 501c3 organizations, which are charitable, religious, and educational. And yours is charitable, right, or is it educational?
Well, it's a little bit of both, but
Okay,
yeah.
but you're asserting for yourself the right to collect money to put in political campaigns, to get politically active, and that would apply also for the United Way, Harvard University, Howard University, every university in the country, which traditionally have been totally non-political and nonpartisan. Now, they can have someone come and speak, like from the pulpit at graduation, and it could be President Trump, it could be President Obama, what have you. Nobody's revoking their 501c3 status for making a political statement there, right? That's offering a little micro speech for them. But it's another thing to take money out of the corporate treasury of the university and put it in politics. But you think that's their First Amendment right. I'm just trying to clarify here intellectually.
Again, and with all due respect, I recognize that this is a multifaceted discussion. I think fundamentally that less government is better. And if we want to point the finger of abuse, I think the finger should be pointed directly at the Internal Revenue Service.
I agree, and you might be talking about administrative abuse. I don't know the facts. I'd love to get more about them, but that's administrative abuse and harassment. But that's different from what the law is. We've got to determine what the law is going to be, right? Would you agree, for example, that government itself cannot spend money in political campaigns? Like, we don't want the Department of Education or the Department of State going out and spending money in Raskin for Congress or Meadows for president. Would you agree to that?
I believe the government should govern itself, yes.
Okay, well, so the First Amendment doesn't guarantee somebody who's in government the right to spend money in that way, and I don't think it guarantees the right of a not-for-profit corporation which collects tax-deductible contributions and itself is tax-exempt to participate in politics. And that's basically the line that was drawn with the Johnson-Eisenhower Amendment back in the 1950s that we've had, and it's never been struck down. And most people think that it tracks perfectly the separation of church and state. And nothing that I've heard disproves that. But I want to ask a tough question for Rabbi Saperstein. Do ministers and rabbis and imams, and you name it, do they have a right or do they not have a right to go through their whole theological disquisition on whatever it might be, Easter or Passover, you name the holiday, and then say, and therefore, everybody should vote for Donald Trump for president? Can they say that or can they not?
They have a free speech right to say that.
They have a First Amendment right to say
Right.
it. And do you know of any cases where they're being put in jail for doing that, or the 501c3 status of the church is being revoked for doing that?
Again, the Pierce Creek Church and the Branch Ministries case, in which they took out a full-page
They took
ad
out
in New
ads.
York.
That was
Right.
spending,
But I don't
right?
know of anyone in
Okay,
who's
because-
facing that.
see,
in
this
terms
to
of
me
the pulpit.
isolates the critical issue, okay? I would have a serious problem with the IRS or any other government entity entering a church and dissecting someone's sermons or trying to castigate or chasten or punish them for saying something, even if it's something as political, and therefore everybody go vote on Tuesday against Donald Trump or for Donald Trump. I just, and I've got a problem with that. But I think that the vast majority of the American people have accepted the idea that churches should not be political slush funds, and we should not be able to take tax-deductible money given to churches for charitable and educational purposes and put directly into political campaigns. And I haven't heard anything today, and I'll close with this. If anybody wants to convince me why churches or Harvard University or or the United Way should be involved in our political campaigns on the money basis? Rabbi Saperstein.
Yeah, I just want to reassure Mr. Heiss. I don't know if you were out of the room when I was very clear about this. The money issue I was dealing with on the broader question of the repeal of the Johnson Amendment. I explicitly said that your bill is aimed at obviating that. Although I would ask you, under the Buckley v. Vallejo and Citizens United case, thread of cases that says that campaign money is expressive conduct that is deserving of constitutional protection here. If you open the door to free speech in the churches here with tax-deductible money, here, does that then become another form of expression, another form of speech? Here, that I certainly think we will get lawsuits to that effect from people. So even there, I have concerns, but I explicitly differentiated your...
I mean, just to reclaim my time for a second, if I might, I mean, the Hobby Lobby case dangerously opens the idea that churches are political organizations. And that's why I wanted to make sure that everybody, with the exception of Ms. Engelbrecht, believes that the 501c3 exemption should stand. Because if it doesn't, understand what's going to happen. The moment that you say that churches are just like the Democratic Party or the Republican Party or any other political organization, it might last for a year or two. It might be great for the churches that want to do it. But then everybody's going to say, well, why are they tax exempt? And why can people give money to them on a tax deductible basis? Because all the money is going to start to flow in that direction. I'd be an idiot to give my money $100 to the Democratic Party instead of giving it to the Unitarian Church and let them spend it that way if they had the right to do it. You see, so that's why I assume all of these churches and religious organizations are saying, no, don't go there. Beware what you wish for.
I explicitly raise that fear and concern. We have special protections in the religious community, in the houses of worship, that other entities don't have. A number of exemptions on the basis we are not like everyone else. Only we have an establishment clause that affects the religious entities of this country here. And if you start asking to be treated like everyone else in this regard, we really endanger those exemptions. So I'm very glad that you raised that issue.
Mr. Chairman, if I may.
Please.
Thank you. Well, Mr. Raskin, I just wanted to say I'm delighted to hear that it sounds like we agree on the fundamental premise that the IRS should not be censoring pastor sermons. And that's really relieving to me, because that's really all the Free Speech Fairness Act is going to do, again, is just create that free speech valve. And it should allay your concerns about campaign finance law, because it doesn't touch it.
Well, that's what you're saying, but that's not what the language of the bill says at this point. And the reason why everybody's talking about dark money is because the way it's written is it completely opens up a vast reservoir of divine dark money to pour into the political process. But you're saying that's not the purpose here. And I understand that the sponsor's not saying that. So that's all a question of draftsmanship in the legislation.
Respectfully, all the language of the bill actually does, it says within the ordinary course of your ministry, and as long as it incurs no more than de minimis or incremental expenses, which is an extremely common
But
phrase
what if
in
my
tax
ministry...
law. Easy to apply.
Ms. Holcomb, let me ask you,
Pastors should be able to
what if my
understand.
ministry... See, in America, we have such radical, expansive, wide open, robust freedom of religion that everybody can define their religion as they please, right? And what if my ministry is, my theology tells me I've got to get involved in politics however I can? And then we repealed the Johnson Amendment, and so suddenly we say, I can take all of the money that's coming into me and go spend it in a campaign because that's what my theology tells me to do.
Under Free Speech Fairness Act, they're going to have a really rough time of it because it's only de minimis expenditures. Again, and only speech that can be done in the ordinary course of their normal ministry. This is not a cataclysmic event. We're simply talking about a relief valve for free speech.
Okay.
I just wanted to let the record show that the professor, who's not a member of either subcommittee, got more time than anyone else, and we appreciate.
And I'm very grateful
appreciate
for
him being here.
Being a professor and all. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank our witnesses for taking time out of your schedule to be with us here today. We deeply appreciate it, and for all the participation from the committees. We're good? All right. If there's no further business, without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.